the battlefield had gone quiet. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but quiet in the way a graveyard was quiet. Smoke drifted across the shattered plain, carrying the bitter scent of scorched metal and burnt flesh. The sky above, once bright with orbiting fleets, now flickered with dying debris falling like cold stars. Kethra couldn't move. She lay half-buried beneath the twisted wreckage of a shattered transport walker, her lower limbs crushed beneath its immense weight. Her species, the Valori, were built for speed and agility, long, jointed limbs, flexible exoskeletal plating, and nerves finely tuned for rapid response. Now all of that meant nothing. Pain lanced through her body in sharp, unbearable waves. She had tried to pull free earlier. She remembered the tearing sensation, the sickening crack of internal structures giving way. After that, she had stopped trying. Now she waited. For death. Or worse. The enemy would come eventually. The Draith Collective always did. They harvested survivors, alive if possible. Conscious, preferably. Kethra's breathing slowed as her body attempted to conserve energy. Her vision dimmed slightly, the edges blurring as exhaustion crept in. She had already sent her final transmission hours ago, coordinates, casualties, confirmation of total loss. No one was coming. That was the logical conclusion. And yet she stayed awake, because instinct refused to let her die quietly. Time passed. Minutes? Hours? She wasn't sure anymore. The distant rumble of collapsing structures had faded. The crackle of fires had softened into an occasional whisper. Even the sky seemed quieter, as though the universe itself had turned away from this place. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Kethra's eyes snapped open, her pupils narrowing instinctively. Heavy. Measured. Not the skittering multi-limbed motion of Draith units. Something else. Her hearts began to pound. She turned her head slightly, ignoring the sharp protest of her body. Through the haze of smoke, a figure emerged. Tall, broad, encased in dark armor, scarred and dented from battle. Human. Kethra froze. She had heard of them, of course. The newest species to join the Galactic Coalition. Unpredictable, aggressive, resilient to a degree that bordered on absurd. And dangerous. Very dangerous. The human soldier approached cautiously, scanning the wreckage with a weapon held low but ready. His helmet visor flickered with faint data readouts, reflecting the burning world around him. Then he saw her. Kethra braced herself. This was it. She had seen how humans fought, how they finished enemies. Quick, efficient, without hesitation. Better that way, she told herself. Better than the Draith. The human stepped closer. Closer. He stopped just a few meters away, studying her. Kethra met his gaze, or where his eyes would be behind the visor. She tried to keep her expression neutral, though pain made it difficult. Go ahead, she whispered, her voice dry and broken. Do it quickly. The human didn't move. For a moment, there was only silence between them. Then he did something unexpected. He lowered his weapon. Kethra blinked, confused. What? She started. The human knelt beside her. Not to strike. Not to aim. But to look closer at the wreckage pinning her down. That thing's got you pretty bad, he said, his voice muffled slightly through the helmet, but unmistakably calm. Kethra stared at him. You're not going to kill me? The human tilted his head slightly, as if the question itself puzzled him. Why would I do that? Kethra hesitated. Because I am defeated. I cannot fight. I am a liability. The human let out a short breath, something between a sigh and a quiet laugh. Yeah, he said. That's not really how we do things. Before she could respond, he stood and moved around the wreckage, examining its structure. His hands ran along the twisted metal, testing its stability. Cathra watched him, confusion slowly giving way to something else. Hope. A dangerous, fragile hope. You cannot lift that, she said after a moment. It weighs several tons. The human didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back, planting his feet firmly against the ground. He reached down, gripping a section of the collapsed walker with both hands. Cathra's eyes widened. No, she said. You will injure yourself. The human grunted and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the metal groaned, shifted, lifted. Cathra felt the pressure on her lower body lessen slightly. Her breath caught. That's it, the human muttered, straining. Come on. Muscles strained beneath his armor. The servos in his suit whined under the increasing load. Slowly, impossibly, the wreckage began to rise. Cathra stared in disbelief. No, that is not possible. With a final effort, the human lifted the debris just enough to create a narrow gap. Can you move? He asked, his voice tight with effort. Cathra tried. Pain exploded through her body, but she forced herself to shift, dragging her upper body free. Her lower limbs, she couldn't feel them. I cannot. Just keep moving, the human said. I've got it. She obeyed. Inch by inch, she pulled herself out from beneath the wreckage. Every movement felt like tearing through fire, but she didn't stop. Finally, she was clear. The human let go. The wreckage slammed back into place with a deafening crash. Cathra lay on the ground, gasping for breath. Alive. She was alive. The human knelt beside her again, already pulling a medkit from his pack. All right, he said. Let's see what we've got. Cathra watched him, still struggling to process what had just happened. You saved me. Yeah, he replied simply. But why? The human paused for a moment, as if considering the question. Then he shrugged. Because you needed saving. Cathra had no response to that. He began applying treatment, sealing wounds, stabilizing her vitals, injecting something that dulled the worst of the pain. You're lucky, he said. Another hour, and you probably wouldn't have made it. Cathra let out a weak laugh. I was not expecting to make it at all. Yeah, well, he said. Plans change. She studied him more closely now. The armor, though heavily damaged, bore the insignia of a human military unit. His movements were precise, practiced, but there was a gentleness to them that she hadn't expected. What is your name? She asked. Sergeant Daniel Hayes, he replied. Cathra, she said. Of the Valori Expeditionary Force. Nice to meet you, Cathra, he said, as if they were meeting under entirely different circumstances. She almost smiled. Hours passed as they waited. Hayes stayed with her the entire time. He shared his water, adjusted her position to keep her comfortable, even spoke to her about Earth, about the war, about the strange absurdities of human life. Cathra listened, at first out of curiosity, then out of something deeper. You are very different from what I expected, she admitted at one point. Hayes chuckled. Yeah? How so? I was told humans were brutal, efficient, ruthless. He nodded. We can be. But you are also, she hesitated, kind. He didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, we try to be. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the distant sound of engines filled the air. Rescue. Cathra felt a surge of relief. They are coming, she said. Hayes nodded, standing and signaling with a flare. Moments later, a coalition dropship descended through the smoke, its lights cutting through the darkness. Medics rushed out, quickly assessing the situation. Cathra was lifted onto a stretcher, her body carefully stabilized. As they carried her toward the ship, she reached out, grabbing Hayes' arm. Wait. He looked at her. You could have left me, she said. No one would have known. Yeah, he said. But I would have. Kethra held his gaze for a long moment. Thank you, she said softly. Hayes gave a small nod. Take care of yourself, Kethra. Then she was gone. Epilogue. Months later, Kethra stood once more. Her lower limbs had been replaced, advanced prosthetics, stronger than before. The scars remained, but they no longer defined her. She had returned to duty, but she was not the same. None of them were. The war continued, as wars always did. Battles were fought. Lives were lost. Worlds burned and were rebuilt. But something had changed. A story had spread of a human soldier who had stayed behind on a battlefield to save a fallen alien, of strength beyond reason, of compassion beyond expectation. It spread through the ranks of the coalition, carried from one system to another. A reminder that humanity was not defined solely by its capacity for war, but by its refusal to abandon those in need. Kethra found him again eventually. Sergeant Hayes. They met not on a battlefield, but in a quiet station overlooking a distant star. You look better, he said, glancing at her new limbs. I am better, she replied. There was a pause. Then she said, I owe you my life. Hayes shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Kethra smiled slightly. Perhaps not, she said. But I will spend my life proving that your actions mattered. Hayes looked at her, a hint of a smile forming. Then I guess it was worth it. They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the stars. Somewhere out there, the war still raged. But here, for just a moment, there was peace, and the quiet understanding that even in the darkest moments, one act of humanity could change everything.